Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Lena O'Rourke, and I'm representing the Protecting Immigrant Families
Es
Coalition, a network of more than 800 organizations dedicated
una red de
to advancing immigrant rights
matuzaciones.
and well-being. I'm delighted to welcome you to Strategies for Inclusion, the Role of Local Governments, a dialogue designed to foster reflection and share experiences on policies and actions that promote effective inclusion of migrants. Before we begin, we want to remind everyone that interpretation services are available today. This conversation will be conducted in both English and in Spanish. You can access interpretation by clicking on the little globe icon and selecting the language that you would like to listen to today's event in, whether in English or in Spanish. If you feel comfortable in both languages, you can choose the original language channel. Again, you'll find that with the little globe in the bar at the bottom of the Zoom. Migration, as it always has been, is an integral part of our societies. Often leaving their countries of origin and fleeing difficult and diverse situations, migrants have unique needs. When these needs are addressed by the receiving communities, the benefits of migration can be fully realized, allowing people to integrate into their new communities successfully. In addition to the fundamental role that civil society plays in this process, local governments can ensure migrants access to essential services, foster social cohesion, and promote their participation in society. It is not an effort by newcomers as we traditionally understand integration, but rather a whole of society approach that we describe as migrant inclusion. While we are witnessing the rise of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments across the world, local governments can demonstrate leadership and respond to this moment by adopting different approaches to counter the shortcomings of national governments. States, provinces, cities, and municipalities can and have developed different strategies to ensure migrant inclusion in spite of the many challenges. Our conversation today will help us understand a conceptual perspective on how migrant inclusion is achieved at the local level, the key strategies that local governments have adopted to work towards inclusion, the challenges that tend to arise, and consideration for future efforts. I invite you all to submit questions you have during the conversation into the Q&A section. You can find that the bottom bar, and you can do that in either language. We're going to save those questions for the end, and we'll address as many as possible in the final part of this event. We're very excited that joining me here today is Juan Pablo Ramaciotti. Juan Pablo is the executive director of the Center for Migratory Policies in Chile, an independent, nonprofit research center dedicated to the evaluation, analysis, and design of migrant policy proposals. Juan Pablo, thank you so much for joining us today. Please feel free to use examples from Chile as you describe this model to us. Welcome. Okay, so to kick us off, Juan Pablo, we speak in general about migrant integration, but what specific elements should we be considering or thinking about when we are designing or intervening in the integration process?
Hello, Lina. Thanks for the invitation. Voy a hacer la presentación en español, pero que quienes necesiten hacerlo en inglés puedan usar la
You
traducción.
can use the
Voy a compartir mi
translation.
pantalla para ir
I will share my
profundizando
screen
sobre estos
to
temas.
begin these
En
topics.
primer lugar, me gustaría
First
compartirles
of
esta
all, I would
figura.
like to
Esto a partir de un
starting
estudio que hicimos
from
en el
a
Centro de
study
Políticas
that we did
Migratorias,
in
en
the
que
Migratory Study Center,
sistematizamos
where
distintas
we
experiencias, investigaciones, informes
systematize different experiences,
de distintos
reports
países
from different
respecto a
countries with
cómo se
regards
puede
to
visualizar
how
y
we
también
can
ordenar
visualize
los
and
distintos procesos
order
de
the
integración
different integration
respecto de
processes with
comunidades
regards
migrantes y en
to
movilidad
migrant
humana
communities in human
desde una
mobility
perspectiva de integración social.
from a perspective
Y
of
vemos
social
que estos
integration,
procesos
and we
tienen
shall see this
cinco
process
grandes áreas de
has
integración.
five great integration areas.
Cuando hablamos, en primer lugar, de
When we talked about
integración
integration.
una línea social,
From a
nos
social
referimos a
line,
qué
we
tipo de
refer
interacciones
to
están teniendo las
what type
personas,
of
qué
interactions people are
relaciones son
having,
capaces de ir
what relations
desarrollando,
are
qué redes pueden contar.
developing, what network they can
Cuando
count
hablamos
on.
de un área estructural,
We're
nos referimos al
talking about
acceso a
structural
derechos y
line,
prestaciones básicas
access
que tienen
to
las
right
personas
and
migrantes, por
basic rights
ejemplo,
that
que puedan
migrant people
participar
have. For
en el
example,
mercado
for them,
inmobiliario, en el acceso a vivienda de manera formal,
access to
que puedan
housing in
ser
a
parte de los sistemas
formal way,
educativos, en el
in
sistema de salud.
education,
El área cultural, en tercer lugar,
in the
se
cultural
refiere
aspects is in
a cuáles
third
son los
place,
valores en evolución que
and
están
what are the
dentro de esa
values and
comunidad,
evolution that are
de los
within the
cuales pueden
community
ser
and of
parte las
which
personas
they can
migrantes, cuáles
be
son
part of the
las
migrant
actitudes,
community.
conductas, estilos de vida de
The
todos
conducts,
los
the studies,
residentes o habitantes de una
the
comunidad y
residents or
cómo las personas
inhabitants of a
migrantes
community,
van siendo
how
parte y
they
van interactuando
can
con esos
how they can be
aspectos culturales.
interacting with
En
culture
cuarto
as
lugar,
these
el área de
cultural aspects.
integración de
In
participación
first
cívica y
place,
política
the
tiene que ver con
civic
la vida
population have
comunitaria y
to
los
do
procesos
with a
democráticos.
community
Esto
and
puede ser, por
democratic
ejemplo, el ejercicio del derecho a votar, pero
exercise to the
también la
right to
participación en
vote,
ciertas
but also
organizaciones
the participation right
comunitarias,
into other
como pueden ser
community
juntas de
organizations
vecinos,
such
organizaciones
as
comunitarias,
neighbor
clubes
associations,
deportivos, etcétera,
sports
donde se van
rights,
integrando
etc.
y van participando de este tipo de
So they
espacios.
can be
Y
participating
la
in this
identidad tiene que
space.
ver con los
And the
procesos a
identity has to
través de
do
los
with the
cuales distintos
processes through
individuos
which
van desarrollando un
they can
sentido de
be
pertenencia a algún
developing a
lugar.
sense
Esto
of
puede ser
belonging to a
a
place.
nivel de
This could
familia, puede ser a
be at
nivel de
family,
barrio, puede
could be at
ser
a
a
neighborhood
nivel
level,
de
it could
comunidades más amplias,
be
puede
at
ser a
a
nivel de un
broader
país.
community, it
Entonces,
could be a
cómo se van
country level
desarrollando
as
esos
well,
sentimientos de
and they could be
identidad
developing those
a medida
sentences,
que las personas van desarrollando su vida en esos
and
espacios.
they could be developed throughout these spaces.
Thank you so much for explaining
Thank you
that
very
out.
much for,
To take it another step further,
and to take it
when we're thinking about this, we're
another step
really
forward.
using the term public policies quite broadly.
And we're talking
And
about
I know you
public policies in a
devoted
general
time
sense,
to mapping
and
out the specific
side
dimensions
time
of public
to
policy that
map
are
the
most critical for
different,
migrants'
those that are
integration.
most
Could you
policies
go
that are
over
more
each of
critical
these?
for integration of these migrants. Can you go
Sí,
over
bueno,
each
en
of these?
esto, cuando nosotros observamos estas áreas de integración, también
When we
identificamos
see this object, we
distintas
identify
dimensiones de
different
políticas
dimensions
públicas
of public
que influyen en
policies
cada una de estas áreas de
that
integración.
influence
Entonces
all
nosotros,
these
en primer
areas.
lugar,
And first of
nos
all,
fijamos en la gobernanza,
we notice
entendiendo
on
la gobernanza
governance,
como
understanding
las
governance
municipalidades o
as
los
the
gobiernos locales en
municipalities
las
or
ciudades
local governments in those
cuentan con una
cities. They
institucionalidad que
have an
permite hacerse cargo
institutionality
de la
that
integración
allows them to
en
be in
sus
charge
distintas
of
líneas de las
integration in the
personas
different
migrantes.
lines of
En
migrant
segundo
people.
lugar, la asistencia a
In second
migrantes, a
place,
personas
migrant
migrantes y
assistance
refugiadas, que tiene que ver con
that has to
poder
do
responder
with
a
being
las
able to
necesidades más importantes que
respond
puedan
to
tener
the
las
most
personas, ya
important
sea
needs that
en
people might
términos
have
de
when it
ayuda
comes
social,
to
en
social
términos de
help,
orientación legal
in
y migratoria,
legal
en
migrant,
términos de acceso a
in
servicios
search of
básicos.
access to
Esto es
basic
relevante sobre todo en los
services,
primeros periodos
and
de la llegada de las
especially to
personas a
the
las
different
comunidades de
places
destino.
in those communities.
Tercero, trabajo y desarrollo
And third,
económico,
we
cómo las
have
personas se van
work and
insertando en el
social
mercado
development,
laboral.
how they're being inserted into the
Cuarto,
job
salud y
market.
bienestar,
And
sobre
first of
todo
all,
acceso a
health
los
and
sistemas de
well-being,
salud
access
locales.
to local health
Quinto,
services.
educación.
And fifth is
Acá
education,
muy importante el
in
acceso a
very
educación
important to access
primaria, a los
to
colegios, a las
primary
escuelas, pero
attention,
también
primary
cuáles son las
education,
formas de acceder a
schools,
educación
colleges, but ways
superior,
to
a
access to
estudios
higher education,
universitarios,
to
técnicos, y también
university or
poder
technical
convalidar
studies,
los
and how
estudios que
to
las personas traen de
validate
sus
those
países de
studies
origen.
that people are bringing back from the
Luego,
countries of
vivienda y
origin.
planificación
And
urbana,
then
cómo la llegada de
housing
nuevas
and urban
personas a las
planning, how
ciudades
the arrival of new people
puede
to the
ser
cities can
un
be
catalizador del desarrollo del mercado
a
habitacional y también
catalyzer for
cómo logramos
developing
que
this
las
sector, how we
personas
can
puedan
achieve
acceder a
that people
vivienda
can
de manera
access
formal,
to
a
housing in a
precios
formal
justos
way
y en
at a
lugares que sean adecuados
price and in
para la
places that are
integración de estas
adequate
personas.
or proper for the integration of these
En
people.
séptimo lugar, la convivencia y no
In seventh
discriminación,
place, we
cómo
have coexistence and
la mezcla de
non-discrimination,
culturas,
how the mixture
cómo
of
también
cultures,
el
how
impacto que la migración puede
the
tener en la vida
impact that
comunitaria
migration
de
can
las
have
personas
on
migrantes,
community
como para
life,
quienes
whether for migrants as well
están en la
as
sociedad
people who
receptora,
are in
se
the
puede abordar de una
receiving
manera en que estas
societies,
diferencias se
can be
abordan de
addressed
manera
where those
positiva.
differences
Y
are
por
addressed
último,
in a
en
positive
asociatividad y
way.
participación,
And
de qué
finally,
manera
when
vamos
it's
generando
association
espacios
and
de
participation, how
relacionamiento,
we
de
can be generating
organización,
spaces for
de
coexistence,
participación
for
en distintos
participation in different contexts, different scales, different types of spaces where social interactions takes place. So all these dimensions are related with the areas of integration, with these 5 areas of integration that explain, and you will be generating interdependence. So we're only capable of developing two or three of these dimensions. We will have difficulties so that integration is created effectively.
So, can you tell us then more broadly about the key strategies that local governments in particular can implement, can develop to ensure migrant inclusion and let's be realistic, what challenges they may face?
Sí, bueno, nosotros junto con la
Well,
Organización Internacional para las
with
Migraciones,
the
la OIM,
International
en
Association
Chile y el Servicio Nacional de Migraciones en
in
Chile, que es
Chile and the
la
Immigration
institución
Services
encargada
in
desde el
Chile, which is the
gobierno
institute in
de
charge from the
gestionar
government to
todos los temas que
manage
tengan que ver con
all the topics
migración y
that
extranjería.
are had to do with
Desarrollamos una guía práctica
foreigners and migrants.
para
We
gobiernos locales
developed a
para que pudieran
practical guide for
desarrollar
local governments
sus
so that
propias políticas migratorias
they can
enfocadas en la
develop their
integración de la población
migration
inmigrante.
policies.
Y dentro de esta guía que tiene
And
distintos
within
pasos,
this
hay
guide,
4 elementos que nosotros
there are
consideramos que
4
son muy
elements
relevantes
that are very
y que suponen un
relevant,
desafío
and
para poder avanzar
they
en
present
las
a
políticas de
challenge to be
integración
able
efectiva,
to
pero también una
advance it with
oportunidad
effective
para poder
migration
abordarlo de
policies,
manera
but also an
más
opportunity to be able
estratégica
to
y
address it in a
también de
more
manera más
strategic
amplia e
way,
integral.
in a
Lo
more
primero es
comprehensive
partir haciendo un diagnóstico
way. But first of all, I want to share a
de cómo está
diagnostic
la ciudad,
and
de cómo está el
how the
mundo
city, how it's
de
depending
cómo se
on
le llame a las subdivisiones
how these
territoriales que
subdivisions,
tengan las
these
ciudades.
territorial
Nosotros en Chile
subdivisions
hablamos de
are called
comunas,
within the city.
son
In Chile, we
distritos
call
que
them these are districts.
¿cuáles son las características de la
What are the
población inmigrante y no
characteristics of
migrante
the
ahí? Y
migrant
ahí
and
puede
non-migrant
ser importante
populations
contar con
there?
data,
Well,
puede
it's
ser
important to have
importante
data.
contar
It could be
con
important
registros
to have
administrativos, pero
administrative
también, y es
records,
muy
but
importante,
also
que
it's
este
important
diagnóstico
that
tenga un
this
componente
diagnostic
territorial
has a
real,
territorial
es decir, que
component
se
as
pueda
well. In
escuchar
other words, to be able to
tanto a los
hear
vecinos que son
where
inmigrantes como
hear from
también
those
a
neighbors
los
who
vecinos que
are
son parte de la
migrants,
comunidad
as well
receptora
as
y poder
those
identificar
neighbors who are
cuál ha
part
sido
of
su
the receiving
experiencia
community, and for them,
en
what
contextos
the
de
experience has
convivencia
been
intercultural,
within
cuáles han sido los desafíos, si se han
intercultural
producido
context,
tensiones,
what
si es
challenges have they
que
faced, have
en
there
ese
been
lugar
tensions, if in
predomina
that
una buena
place
convivencia o en
there's a
general ha habido
predominant
problemas
of
de
good
convivencia entre
coexistence, or
vecinos
have there
migrantes
been
y no migrantes,
problems of
si es que
coexistence
hay
between
prejuicios marcados
migrants
o
and
no,
non-migrants,
si es que en qué lugares se está
if
produciendo
in
una
what
convivencia saludable y
places
en qué
there's
lugares
a
hay
healthy
más problemas
coexistence
sociales.
and in
Y
which
esto es
areas there are
fundamental para
more
poder
social
incorporarlo,
problems.
porque
This is fundamental to
muchas veces
incorporate all of this
trabajar la
because many
migración en
times
los barrios,
working
en las
on migration
comunidades,
in
puede ser
neighborhoods, in
conflictivo y
communities,
puede haber
can cause
vecinos
a
y
conflict, and
comunidades que no quieran
neighbors and communities that don't want
ser parte de espacios
to
en que lo
be
que se busca
part
es
of
integrar a
spaces
los
where
migrantes al
what
tener
they're
una
seeking is
percepción
to
negativa de la
integrate
migración. Y por
because of
eso
the
es muy
negative perception
importante,
of these same
primero que
migrants.
nada,
So this
escuchar
is why
a
it's
las distintas
important, first
voces
of all, to
y
hear from the
segundo
different
es
voices, and
incorporarlo
second of
al
all,
momento
is to
de empezar a
incorporate it
planificar una
when
política.
we start planning a policy.
En segundo lugar, es muy importante que haya una política
It's important for
formalizada
there to
con
be
una
a
visión de
formalized
mediano y largo plazo,
policy
que no
with a
sea
mid to
solamente una
long,
política, que es lo que
but
nosotros
only
hemos
for
visto
it
que
to
pasa
be a
en
policy, which is what we've
muchas ciudades en
seen
Chile, en
that happens in
Latinoamérica
many
también,
cities in Chile,
en
Latin
que
America as
los
well.
gobiernos locales se
The
enfocan
local
en lo urgente,
governments
que es el
are
presupuesto
focused on
fundamental,
what's urgent,
que
which is, of
son cosas
course,
que se necesitan
fundamental,
para
which
ayer.
is what we need
Por
for
ejemplo, la
yesterday. For
asistencia social,
example,
la orientación
the social
migratoria, la conexión
assistance,
con redes para suplir
the
necesidades básicas,
working with networks
pero
in
es
order to
importante que la
provide basic
municipalidad o
services.
que el
But it's
gobierno local
important that the local
tenga una
government
visión
or
de hacia dónde quiere avanzar en el
have
mediano
a
y en el
vision
largo plazo
towards where
y
they
eso
want to advance in the mid to long term, and
sea
for this to
aterrizado o se
be
concrete en una política formal, que sea una
finalized in a
decisión de la
formal
municipalidad o
policy,
del
for it to
gobierno
be a
local
decision
hacia dónde va a
from the
avanzar,
local
cuáles
government
van a ser los
towards where they
objetivos
want to
de
advance,
integración de la población
what the
inmigrante
objectives will be of
y a
for the
través de qué medidas
integration of these
específicas van a avanzar
migrants, and through which specific
hacia esos
measures they
objetivos.
will advance towards their
En
final
tercer lugar,
objective.
la
In third
coordinación
place,
y la gobernanza
coordination
multiniveles, algo que hemos
and
visto que muchas veces
multi-level
nunca se
governance, something that
dividen
we've seen
por falta de
many times
tiempo, muchas veces de los
because of lack
funcionarios,
of
o a
time,
veces por
maybe
falta de
from
voluntad
the
política,
public
a veces
officials,
simplemente
or
por
because of
burocracia
lack
y
of public
coordinación,
policies,
pero
policies
cuando los
or
gobiernos
lack or
locales
too
son
much
capaces
bureaucracy.
de
But many
coordinarse de manera
times local governments are able to effectively coordinate with the higher levels than at national or subnational levels. And sometimes they're even capable of coordinating with other sectors, such as civil society, the academy, community organizations, organizations of international cooperation. This is where we can generate a synergy that could be multiply the efforts that are done separately how to solve problems that individually are not solved. So it's very important that when thinking of a policy, it's get involved in its design actors and to also plan to work with those actors when you implement these policies. And a fourth element, which we feel it's important to prioritize, is that it's these policies for them to be transversal. That when we talk about migration policies, don't think about just the in the local government that are focused on tending to the needs of migrants. Instead, units of the for the different units of local governments have their own agenda towards integration. For example, if we have an office that's focused on job insertion, what we don't want to happen is that from these offices they send these migrants to the migration offices. Instead, the job insertion office has the elements and to work with them. And this way, from the different areas of the work of the local government, to be able to take charge universal way of services that are for all citizens, but incorporating elements to adjust us to the context for the needs of these migrants.
Juan Pablo, thank you. That's a lot. I would remind everyone and invite you to put any questions into the Q&A section at the bottom. We'll get to the questions at the end. Juan Pablo's been saying a lot of just really foundational, important things, and I'm sure you have questions. We will have time at the end, so be sure to put those in the Q&A. Juan Pablo, how do we assess what works and what policies have been effective? These strategies are clearly important, but how do you assess it and evaluate the effectiveness?
Bueno, hay distintos elementos que son importantes. Nosotros, en esta guía que te comentaba,
there are different elements which are important. For example, in this guide that I mentioned, to make it as simple as possible to measure things, we shouldn't have things to measure things that are complex or evaluating a whole load of information, because that makes it more difficult for the local officials to implement this in an effective way. One of the barriers is the lack of human resources that sometimes are suffered by local governments, and also lack of technical capacity. So we shouldn't only have measures for them to be simple and to allow to give follow-up that doesn't require much work. Thus, so they should have objectives and key simple indicators in all of these dimensions that I mentioned previously. For example, if we're going to work on education, make sure that the school desertion rate of boy and girl migrants, for it to reduce in a certain percentage during the first year. This is data that the local governments usually have. Or exist is used to measure policies that are included within the objective. That's the first thing. Second is that the objectives, the data, and the reports are done in a constant way. For us to have a policy that's going to last 4 years, for example, these are the goals for the first year, and then every quarter, we're going to ask the units who are in charge of each goal for it to be able to report what is the level of progress with these goals or objectives they've had. And these for them to be formal, because if we develop a policy with objective goals in the midterm and we're not following up on this, it might lead to for this to be diluted in time. So it's important to have spaces for accountability and to be able to be assessing us. And this takes us to the third element, where it's important for the evaluation to be internal with these local governments, but also give spaces for the communities to provide feedback of what they've been thinking about the integration or implementation of these programs, because it might be that we're fulfilling our goals, but the repercussions for the local government might not be satisfactory. And this makes it possible for us to be reconfiguring policies in time based on these internal policies, but also based on the feedback we receive from the communities. Also, there are challenges that we've identified that tend to be the main difficulties to be able to carry out successful integration policies at a local level. First of all, is this short-term vision, which I mentioned previously, and it's normal. The local governments are worried about the immediate urgencies, and they don't have the time or resources to look beyond this. So spaces that require support from the political actors in local governments, for example, the mayors. It allows, in a short period of time, where they make the diagnosis, to elevate the perspective, to set those more strategic objectives, and not only worry about what's happening right now. So to formalize these processes helps to generate spaces to be able to planify in a more strategic way. Second, we have previously, there's fragmented action, which is divided in different institutes who do whatever they can without coordinating with the other ones. And many times this requires additional effort for this. It requires time and political willpower, but once the coordination takes place, the processes are faster, are more efficient, they generate better results. And for the same reason, it's an effort that's worth doing. It requires an investment of time and willpower, but gives good results. And third one, and this is the main one, we prepared this guide working with different municipalities. The main barrier they mention is that they have limited human resources and limited economic resources. So it's important, if the mayor's office is planning migration integration, it's important that the majority of these actions do not require additional economic resources. There's a lot that can be improved by simply having a common vision, setting common objectives and common plans that don't require additional economic resources. And we've also seen good practices from municipalities that coordinate with other institutes that allow them to supply the lack of human resources or lack of economic resources. For example, a mayor's office in the southern part of Chile, which Portamont, that's a city here, made an alliance with a university in the city. And this university created a legal clinic to be able to tend to migrant needs in agreement with the mayor's office. So they have lawyers and interns and practitioners in order to provide legal counsel. This is something that could not have been done by itself, by the mayor's office by itself, because they didn't have those resources. So collaborating in that sense allow them to deal with these limitations. Fourth, there's low political prioritization on the migration issue when it comes to local governments. It's sometimes not popular in certain contexts, and because many times, since migrants don't vote, they're not a priority for these mayors. So when it's not a political priority, many times it stops being a priority for public policy and also a social priority. So to be able to carry out a process like this one, where what they seek is participation from organisms or units in the local government, it requires a minimum of political prioritization. On the contrary, it'll just be a few people, a handful of people trying to deal with this, but it's difficult for this to work if there isn't greater political support. And then this varies depending on which city we're talking about, but we tend to see that the public officials don't have enough technical capacity to carry out these types of processes. This is the same reason why this guide, which is available in our website, if you're interested in seeing it, tries to make it as simple as possible and tries to incorporate elements so that people can learn to use it in the as they're advancing in the process. But it also helps where there are alliances that allow to provide more technical capital to these processes. This can be done through sometimes organizations within the civil society who could accompany these processes. We ourselves went to accompany 3 municipalities for their planification migration policies. So it's important to be seeing how we can complement what the mayor's office has with the capacities from other institutions. Another element that's very important and tends to be a barrier is the dependency on migration policies, which normalize their legal status in order to advance. And what happens many times is that municipalities or local governments don't have those attributions to regularize. They can only hand out information, and regularization depends on the central government. And there are many which depend on them having a legal status. For example, access to formal employment, access to health services, access to education, access to a lease contract or a rental contract. That tends to be the greater challenge that local governments face when regularizing migrant people. And finally, we have the perceptions around migration. There could be cities or communities where there's a positive perception on migration, yet there are others where there's a lot of stigmatization or migrants are discriminated, where they perceive that they're competing with the local residents for access to basic services, access to work. And this could complicate what is the vision they have as a local government when it comes to promoting one of these policies.
So these are all challenges, and you've talked about the importance of addressing the challenges. What strategies then can be put in place to systematically address these challenges? What do we do?
Bueno, yo diría que acá hay que saber
Well, I
adaptarse a
would
cada contexto.
that we have to
Fórmula
adapt to
no
each
puede
context.
replicar
There is no
el
formula you
copy-paste
could
en los distintos lugares.
simply copy paste everywhere.
Y por lo mismo,
And for the
es
same
importante que
reason,
estas
it's
estrategias,
important that these
consideraciones
strategies or
sean tomadas con
considerations
flexibilidad.
are
Siempre es más
taken with
importante
flexibility. It's
que lo
more
que pueda decir un
important
papel,
what
cuál
a
es la
piece of paper
experiencia y la
can
visión
say,
que
what is
haya
the
y el conocimiento de la
experience or
comunidad.
vision that
Pero
exists
algunas cosas que nosotros
based on the
nos han
experiences of the
salido
community. But as they've been,
funcionando
what has been
es,
working
en primer lugar, que
is,
las políticas
first
tienen que
of all,
ser
that the
para toda la
policies have to
comunidad,
be
no
for the
solo para la
entire
población
community,
migrante. De
not only
manera que si es que vamos a
in
impulsar una
such a way
política
where if we're going to be
migratoria a
promoting
nivel local, tiene que ser
migratory
una política
policy
que
at a
vaya en
local level,
beneficio
it's one
de
that
todos los vecinos, de
benefits
todas las
all the
comunidades,
neighbors
y no
of all the
solamente quienes son
communities,
extranjeros.
and not only those who
Y
are
eso tiene
immigrant
distintas formas de llevarlo a la
foreigners.
práctica. Uno
And there are
puede ser
different
que los
ways to put
servicios
this.
que se ofrezcan para migrantes
One way
sean
is that
dirigidos
those
también para el resto de la
those
población.
services that are
Otro
offered
puede
to the
ser que hayan
migrants
políticas,
are
por
available
ejemplo,
for
para
the
mejorar la
entire population.
convivencia, que
Another one is that
solamente
those policies put in
estén
place to
orientadas
improve
a convivencia
coexistence
entre
for
migrantes
them
y no
not to
migrantes,
be
sino que también
directed
pueden
to
ser
just
dos personas
coexistence between migrants. It could
que no son
be
inmigrantes
between
o
two
que
people who
son
are not
inmigrantes,
immigrants or
y que
communities
también
who are not
haya un
full of
discurso
immigrants,
y un
and
marco
for there
que
also to
apunte a que
be a
esto avanza en
framework or
beneficio de todos,
discourse
tener
that
migrantes,
this
personas
advances for the
migrantes bien
benefit of
integradas,
everybody,
no
to
beneficia
have
solamente a esas
well
personas, sino que
integrated migrant people,
beneficia a la
not for the
comunidad
benefit of
completa,
themselves, but instead it will benefit the
y no es que
entire
estén
community. And
entregando
it's not that
beneficios
they're
extraordinarios a la población
giving
inmigrante.
extraordinary benefits just to the
Segundo,
migrant community.
convertir el
Second
tema
of all,
migrante en una prioridad política. Y eso requiere estrategias
into
diferentes en
a
distintos
political
contextos.
priority, and
Por
this
ejemplo, en
comes
Chile
different contexts. For
no
example, in
mucho que se está
Chile,
vinculando a
what's
nivel de
happened
discurso
is that's
público
being linked
la
to a
inmigración
public
con
discourse
delincuencia
that
o la
immigration
temas de
with
seguridad.
delinquency or issues
Y
with
algo que
public
nosotros hemos
security or
intentado
public
hacer
safety. And
es
something we've
decir que
attempted to do is say that
una política migratoria seria
a
y responsable
serious migration
si
policy
quiere
and a
hacerse
responsible
cargo de
migration
temas de
policy,
seguridad, lo que tiene
if
que
it
hacer
wants
es
to be in
proteger
charge of
a
topics of
migrantes
security,
para que no sean
what it has to do is
víctimas,
protect
por
migrant people
ejemplo, de bandas
to not
criminales
be
que se
victims of
dedican al
criminal
tráfico de
groups
migrantes
are
que se dedican al
who
tráfico de personas,
do
que muchas veces
or
reclutan
migrant
a
trafficking, or
migrantes que
many
están en una
times
situación de
they
vulnerabilidad
recruit
extrema
migrants who are victims of
para a veces a través de
vulnerability,
chantajes o
so
amenazas
that through blackmail or
incorporarlo
threats,
en sus actividades
they want
criminales
to incorporate to them criminal
y por lo
activities.
tanto es
And thus,
importante hacerse
it's
cargo del
important to
tema no
take
desde un
charge of
enfoque populista
this
que a
topic,
veces
not from a
puede
populist
servir
perspective,
en los medios de
which could
comunicación,
work in
pero cuando se
media
trata de lo que
outlets,
pasa
but when it's
en la
about what
ciudad, en las
happens
comunidades,
in the
a
communities,
los alcaldes sobre todo, no les
especially in the
basta
case
con
of mayors,
tener
it's
un
not
discurso
enough
que se vea bien
for
en la
them to have a
prensa,
discourse
sino que
that
tienen que
seems
resolver
good on
problemas
in
concretos.
the media,
Y eso
but
requiere
instead it
políticas
solves concrete
públicas que
problems.
sean serias.
And these require serious
Y
public
hacerse
policies.
cargo del problema de la seguridad
And to
hoy
take
en
charge of
Chile,
the issue of security
nosotros
in
estamos
Chile,
planteando que también
we
requiere
are
hacerse cargo del
proposing that
problema
it
de
requires
integración de la
taking
población
charge of
migrante de
integration
manera
of the
contundente.
migrant population
Y eso no es
in a serious
solamente
and
más control
decisive way,
policial, eso es
and
también integración.
more about having more
Esa es una forma
police
en que
agents,
nosotros
but
estamos
it also
intentando
requires more integration.
de
This is the
resolver
way
el
we're
tema a nivel
attempting
de ciudades.
to
Todavía
elevate
no
the
me atrevería a decir que
city
ha sido
at a city
exitoso, pero
level.
creemos que por ahí puede haber
I can't say
una
it's been
pista
successful
para poder
yet,
abordarlo
but
en
it
la
might be a
región.
hint in order way to address
En
it
tercer
and to
lugar,
prioritize it. In
generar
third place, we
capacidades
have to
institucionales
generate
más allá
institutional
del
capacities
corto plazo. Las
beyond the short
municipalidades,
term.
a mí me
The
tocó trabajar hace
municipalities,
algunos
I
años
had
en
to
una
work
municipalidad y uno
some
ve que
years ago in the
muchas
mayor's
veces hay
office,
mucha
and we
rotación de
see there's a
funcionarios.
lot of staff
A veces el
turnover,
funcionario que está
and
trabajando en temas de
sometimes
migración, a los
somebody
6
who's
meses lo
working
cambian
on
a trabajar en el departamento
issues,
social
6 months later
y
they're
después en un
sent
año
to
está
the
en el
social
departamento de desarrollo
department,
económico.
and
Entonces,
one
hay
year
mucha
later
rotación
they're economic
y ahí es
development
importante que
department.
las políticas
So there's a lot of
migratorias
turnover. So
se
this
hagan
is
cargo de
important
esto.
that
Puede ser a través
migrant
de
authorities take
capacitaciones
charge of
permanentes de
this.
sus
It could be
funcionarios,
through
puede ser a través de
permanent
alianzas con
training of
instituciones,
their
como
public
hablábamos en el caso de
officials,
esta universidad,
alliances
pero hay que estar
with
generando
institutions, for
capacidades de
example, a
manera permanente,
university, but we have
considerando
to be constantly
que
generating
hay alta
capacities,
rotación muchas veces en las
considering
municipalidades
that
y
there's a lot of
entonces
high
los
staff
funcionarios no llegan a
in
la
the
municipalidad
mayor's
con todas las
offices.
capacidades y
Many times
conocimientos que
they
necesitan.
arrive there without the capacities and
Y por
knowledge that they
último,
need. And
atraer a nuevas
finally,
personas
we have to
al tema migratorio.
bring new people to the table to
Al
discuss
menos
it.
en Chile y también
At least
hemos visto que
in
pasa en otros
Chile,
países de la
we've
región,
seen what happens in other
quienes
countries
tienen
in
un
the region.
enfoque
Those who have a
integral
full,
al momento de hablar de políticas
comprehensive
migratorias,
focus
y esto no es
when
solo a
they
nivel
talk
de gobiernos
about
locales, esto
migration.
es
And I'm not
a
talking
nivel
only
general,
about local
quienes
governments, just
conocen
in general terms.
las
Those
políticas
of you
migratorias,
who
quienes
know the
tienen un enfoque
migration
humano,
policies, who have
quienes
a
saben cuáles son
focus,
los pros y
those
contras de
who
ciertas
know what
medidas,
the
suele
advantages
ser
and
un grupo muy
disadvantages
reducido de
are
personas.
of certain
Y a
messages,
veces tratamos de
measures. It's a very reduced
convencernos de cuál
number
es
of
el camino a
people, so we
seguir
have to be
entre quienes ya
convinced
estamos
of what the
convencidos
path to take
de
among
ciertas
those of us
cosas.
who be
Y yo creo que
convinced
ese
on
enfoque
certain
implica dos
things.
desafíos.
And I
Primero,
think this implies
ser
two
capaces de
challenges.
cuestionar
First of all, to be
las
able
cosas de
to
las
be
que ya
capable
nos
of
creemos
questioning
convencidos.
those
Y
things that we are
segundo,
already
ser capaces de
convinced
ampliar
about.
este
And
tema
second, about to be
a distintos
convinced
actores
of
que no necesariamente
expanding
están
this
involucrados en
topic to
temas de
different
migración,
actors who
no
aren't
necesariamente
necessarily
saben
involved
mucho
in
de
migration, don't
políticas
necessarily
migratorias,
know
pero son
much
quienes están
about
influyendo hoy en
migration
el debate
policies,
público.
but who are now
Entonces,
influencing public
hay distintos
policies.
esfuerzos que se pueden
So
hacer
there are different efforts that
a
can be
escala local,
taken. There's the local
tratar de
effort,
involucrar en la discusión y en la
trying
elaboración de
to
estas políticas
get
a
them
distintos
involved in the
actores, no solamente los
preparation
que están
or
directamente
structuring of
involucrados en
these
temas de
public
migración,
policies.
a
There are
escala
different
más
actors
amplia,
that could be
ver
involved
cómo se
to
puede
involve them in a larger
subir a la
scale.
mesa de
How
discusión a
we can
grupos que son relevantes y no
bring
saben quizás tanto de
actors or
migración.
relevant actors to the
Nosotros en
table, those
Chile
who
hicimos
don't
hace poco un
necessarily know much
ejercicio,
about
estuvimos un año
migration.
trabajando con
Recently, we did
distintos
this
think tanks
exercise. We
vinculados
were
a distintas
working
tendencias
with
políticas
for over an
y
hour
elaboramos un
with
documento de consenso
when we
para presentarle a los
prepared a
candidatos
document of
presidenciales en Chile.
consensus to offer to
Eso
the
fue un
presidential
trabajo
candidate.
largo que
Chile.
requirió
This required a
mucho
lot
esfuerzo
of
para
work,
generar consenso, pero
required a lot
también nos
of
permitió
effort to obtain a
subir a la mesa
consensus,
de
but
este
it
tema
allowed
migratorio
us
a centros de
to bring
estudio
to the
que antes no
table
estaban
these
involucrados en el tema
study
y
centers
también
who
buscar
necessarily
consenso hacia
weren't
afuera
involved
respecto
in
de
this
medidas
issue,
prioritarias.
and to
Entonces,
reach consensus
hay
on
muchas
different
estrategias que se pueden
priorities.
usar, quizás estas
There are
cuatro
many
no son las más
strategies that can be
importantes en
used.
algunos
Maybe these
contextos,
four are not
pero
the most
nosotros hemos visto
important
que
ones
son
in
algunas
certain
claves
contexts,
que
but
pueden
we've
ser
seen that they
importantes,
can be key
sobre todo al
strategies
momento
that
de
could be
abordarlos en escala
important,
local.
especially when addressed at a local level.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. That last one in particular resonates with me, and it's certainly how we think about creating movement and building capacity by building the bigger table and bringing different sectors in. And a model we try to replicate at the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition. So thank you for, in particular, for pulling that one out. I have one more question and then we're going to move to a general discussion. So if you haven't already, please put any questions into the Q&A in either language and we'll address those as we have time. Okay, and I'm going to kick us off with one more question, and then we'll get into the audience ones. Juan Pablo, we often see that regularization is a prerequisite for migrants to access service and to ensure their full participation in society. The model that you've walked us through today has lots of different entry points. How do we overcome these hurdles that many are unable to overcome, despite the time, their contributions, their families, and the lives they have built?
Sí, esa es una pregunta muy difícil.
That is a very difficult question.
No te diría que tengo una
I
respuesta
I can't
suficiente,
say that I
pero sí hay ciertas cosas que
the
nosotros hemos
proper
visto que los
response,
gobiernos
but there are
locales,
certain things that we've
al
seen that the
intentar
local
impulsar
governments,
la
when
integración de
attempting
familias o de
to
personas que
promote
no
the
tienen su
integration
estatus
of families or
regular al
people who
día
don't have a regularized
y que
status,
tienen cierto impacto positivo. Por
that they have
ejemplo,
a certain
hay
positive
ciudades que
impact.
lo que han
There
hecho
are
es
cities that what they've
garantizar el
done
acceso a
is
ciertos
they've
servicios,
guaranteed the
pese
access
a que no
to
haya un
certain
estatus regular.
services, even if they don't have
Incluso
regularized
entregando a
status,
veces tarjetas de
even
identificación
by giving
locales que te
local
permiten
identification cards,
acceder a
which allow
servicios
them
en
to
la ciudad.
access
Hay
services within the city.
también, por ejemplo, en
There are
Chile,
also, for example, in
lo que
Chile,
se está haciendo es que
what's
en esta
being
situación
done
migratoria
is that those
irregular
who
se les
are in
entrega
irregular
un número
situation,
de
they are
identificación
given
que
an
no implica
identification
que
number
tienen una
that does
visa
not
o un
imply
permiso de
that they
trabajo,
have a
pero
visa
eso
or a
sí le
work
permite a las
permit,
personas
but it
acceder a
does
los
allow
servicios
people
públicos como
to
por ejemplo
access
educación,
public
salud,
services such as
incluso poder
education, health,
aportar al
even
sistema
being
de
able
seguridad social
to
si
contribute
tienen
to
un
the
contrato de
social
trabajo.
security system if they
Esos
have a
son
work
elementos que
permit
permiten
or work contract.
institucionalizar las
And this
relaciones de
allows them
personas
to
con instituciones
institutionalize the
públicas,
relation of
pese a
the
que no
people
tengan un
with the
estatus
public
regular,
institutions, even if they
que a
don't
veces es un
have
poco
a regular
contradictorio, porque
status,
el Estado
which
no
might
permite
seem
que la persona se
contradictory because
regularice,
the
pero
state
sí le
does not
permite
allow them to
formalizar
regularize,
sus
but
relaciones
allows them to
dentro del país, que
formalize
nosotros creemos que eso
their
es más lo
relationship in the
ideal, pero
country,
es
which
mejor
we are
que
aware is
simplemente
not
mantenerlos en
ideal,
el
but
anonimato y
it's
en la precariedad.
important to have them
Por otro
in
lado,
to keep them
muchas
anonymous.
veces nos encontramos con
On the
que
other
los
hand,
gobiernos
many
locales,
times
si es
we
que la
see that the
persona no
local
está
governments, if the
regularizada, no
person
pueden
is
entregarle
not
servicios,
regularized, they
porque la ley
cannot
no se los
be
permite.
given services
Y en
because
esos
the
casos lo
law
que hemos
does
visto
not
que es más
allow them.
efectivo
What we've seen
es
that's
hacer
more
alianzas con
effective is to
organizaciones de
create
la sociedad civil,
alliance
con organismos
civil
internacionales
society
que sí pueden canalizar
organizations
ayuda a
that
estas personas.
can
Entonces ahí
channel
también
help
de
to
nuevo
these
las
people.
alianzas
So once
son muy
again,
importantes.
these alliances are very
Y por otro
important.
lado,
And on the other,
también
and also
hay una parte
there's
del proceso de integración que
there's
no tiene solo
another
que ver
part of
con
the
recursos
integration
económicos,
part that does
sino
not
que con la
only have to do
generación de espacios
with
de
economic
convivencia,
resources, but also spaces for
con tener discursos que
systems,
no
for
criminalicen la
having
migración irregular
discourses that
y que
don't
permitan que la
criminalize
comunidad
regular
se conozca,
migration and
porque
allows
la
community to get to
experiencia
know one
personal
another, and that the
sea más
personal
importante
experience
de
to be
convivir
more
unos con otros,
important than
sea más importante que muchas
for it to
veces el discurso que
be
aparece en la
more
prensa.
important than the
Y las
discourse that
municipalidades que nosotros hemos
appears
visto que han
in the public
traccionado y
discourse, and those
promovido ese
communities
tipo de
that we've seen that
convivencia
have
hace que
promoted
la
that
vida de
type
las
of
personas
coexistence
migrantes
makes
o
that the
personas en
life of
situación
the
regular o
migrant
irregular
people,
pueda ser
regardless
mucho
of their
mejor
regular or irregular status,
que
can
la
be
vida de
much
aquellas personas que
better
por estar en
than the
estatus
lives
irregular
of those people who, because of
permanecen
their
al
irregular
margen de la vida
status,
comunitaria,
are
que eso es
cast
uno de los grandes
aside
problemas
or
que puede producir
excluded.
la migración
And this
irregular.
could be by
That was an
irregular
excellent answer to
migration.
a hard question. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move into some questions now from the audience, Juan Pablo. And we had two that are related, and they go back to your opening slides. And they're about immigration policy. So, where is immigration policy in your model? Is it developed regardless of immigration status? So, when you're thinking about it, how do you address the specific protections needed by different statuses, refugees, unaccompanied children? How does immigration status fit into your model?
Sí, es una muy buena pregunta.
Mhm.
Yo creo que hay ciertas
That is a
cosas
very good
que pueden
question.
ser
I think that there are
transversales.
certain things that could
Por ejemplo,
be
de qué
transversal for it.
manera
can we guarantee access to health services and education for those in human mobility, regardless if they are refugees, if they are migrants due to economic reasons, people that come maybe not as refugees, but with certain protection needs. It could also be the same way we create spaces for coexistence, but they require more specific actions. For example, when we talk about boys, girls, and adolescents, there are boys, girls, and adolescents who have arrived at the country separated from their families or unaccompanied. That requires specific action. Protection for integration to guarantee when we have a refugee population, for example, it's worth making extraordinary efforts in order to coordinate with the local government so they could process their asylum request, but also for migratory regulation with a common denominator being the migrant population. Many times people who arrive and are refugees, especially in Latin America, Spanish between Spanish-speaking countries, and sometimes we receive refugee populations that come from very different cultural or language-wise contexts, and this makes it much more difficult for their are extraordinary. And so also working with migrant populations in regular status require different efforts than people in irregular conditions, because those in regular status in the first months or years of arrival, there could be certain gaps, but what disappear with the passage of time, especially when it comes to work conditions, comes to housing, comes to their income, access to institutions. When a family is able to be economically integrated, that tends to be one of the main keys to integrate the other sectors or areas. But when we talk about irregular status, there are certain barriers that time. So that requires constant work to at least mitigate somewhat those barriers that are generated. This is where I would say the main challenge is the institutional capacity to take charge in different characteristics or different facets. And for the same reason is why I mentioned that alliances are important. It's ridiculous to think that a local government or municipality to think that a local government or municipality will be able to address all of these issues.
Okay, so one of the things we should acknowledge is that sometimes local governments change and new people come in. What strategies do you adopt to ensure the implementation of policies without local government changes interrupting the process? How do you address that?
Sí, es difícil. Nosotros tuvimos la experiencia en Chile.
Yes, this is difficult. We had the experience in Chile because the pilot project of the study, we did it in 3 cities, and because of the terms of the study, it was done right before the elections for local governments. These 3 cities all changed their mayor. 3 of these cities changed their. Only one of them had the same, was re-elected. So I think it's important that when you prepare or redact these policies, you include different public sectors, which you hope which is a consensus regarding different policies about migration in the mid to long term. And you hope that's a policy that interprets for future authorities, future administrations. And there could also be a role from civil society in case there is a change in authority to present what is the progress that has been made, what are the challenges that maybe the prior authorities were not able to solve, to show the path of continuity as the social path, the path that socially speaking, politically speaking, and administratively, it's the one that's would benefit the most for the community to maintain, because you could appeal to the goodwill of the authorities, but we have to do the political convenience factor for it to be realistic to maintain this continuity.
Think about what we need to do now to future proof against those changes. So I like the way to think about that. Changing topics a little bit, language access can be a significant barrier here, and it can be a considerable cost for local governments. How can it be addressed when responsibilities for migrants' integration are assigned to multiple divisions? How do you deal with language access?
Sí, bueno, nosotros la visión que tenemos de
A
cómo una
vision that we
municipalidad
have regarding how a municipality or local government can address the different migration
se pueda
problems
transversalizar, como decía
is
antes,
for it to be
el trabajo que
transversal,
hacen
as
los
I
migrantes desde
mentioned
distintas unidades,
before, when it comes to
pero
the work
siempre es bueno
done within the
que
different offices,
exista alguna
but
unidad que
it's
se
always
especialice en
good for there
temas
to be a unit that
que están
specializes in topics that are
directamente vinculados a las
that are
características,
directly
contextos,
linked
las
to the
necesidades que tienen
characteristics
las
of the
personas que llegan.
needs of
Por
the migrant
ejemplo, la
people. For
asesoría
example,
en trámites
the
migratorios. Es difícil entonces
counseling in
pasarlo a otras
migration
unidades.
procedures, it's difficult
La
to just
capacitación de
transfer them to
funcionarios
another
y de
unit.
comunidades
The the capacity of these public officials
de
and
convivencia
communities when it comes
intercultural
to
también se necesita de una
intercultural
unidad
coexisting
más especializada y
criteria
ojalá sea
that
una
could
especie de
be
debate
focused in a
con el
very
resto de la
very
municipalidad.
unique unit, maybe could be a
Respecto de
back
las
office issue.
barreras de lenguaje,
With regards to language
nosotros hemos
barriers,
visto que ha
what we've
funcionado más
seen
son las
that has
alianzas con
worked the most
universidades,
are
con
alliances with
ONGs que
universities,
pueden
NGOs
desarrollar cursos
that
de
could
español
develop
incluso. Nosotros,
Spanish
la
speaking courses,
comunidad en
for
Chile que
example.
tiene
The
más
community in
dificultades con el
Chile that
español es la
has
haitiana.
greater
Lo que mejor ha
difficulties with Spanish
funcionado
is
ha
the
sido a
Haitian
veces cursos
community.
que dan
And what
las
has worked the
municipalidades y es en
most are
español.
those courses
Pero cuando
given by
tienen los
these.
recursos, muchas
But when they
veces
were
hay
given the
fundaciones
resources,
que hacen
there are
alianzas con las
foundations who
municipalidades,
make
hay
alliances with
universidades
the
que hacen alianzas con las
municipalities. There
universidades,
are
y
also
eso
make
puede dar
these
buenos resultados.
alliances with the mayor's offices, and this could provide good results.
So, changing the topic a little bit here, away from sort of the systematic strategies, but in your opinion, is there a minimum percentage of the general population that needs to be migrants to that makes it necessary to apply this model? It's a very specific question, but getting at what percentage of density of migrants works best in your model?
Qué difícil la pregunta.
That is a difficult
Yo creo
question.
que
I think that
mientras mayor porcentaje de migrantes hay en una
the
ciudad,
larger
más
population of
necesario se
migrants in a
hace
determined
tener una
city, it
estrategia
becomes
bien
more
pensada al respecto,
necessary to have a well thought
pero también más difícil
strategy,
lo hace. Nosotros, por
but it
ejemplo, en
also
Chile
makes it more
tenemos
difficult.
comunas
In
que
Chile,
casi la
we have
mitad de las
these
personas son
comunas,
extranjeras.
which is almost half of the people are
Desarrollar ahí
foreign.
una política
To
integral es
develop
prioritario, pero
a
también es mucho más
comprehensive
difícil.
policy is a priority, but it's also
Entonces,
more
hay
difficult.
que ir
So
adaptando la estrategia según las
we have
características
to
del
adapt a
lugar.
strategy based on the
Lo menos que
characteristics
se
of the
necesita,
specific
creo
place.
yo, es
What is less needed, in my opinion,
nosotros en Chile hemos
is
visto que
in
esto
Chile
se ha
we've
dado de
seen
manera
that
espontánea en las distintas
this
ciudades
has
y comunas.
happened
A medida
spontaneously
que va
in different
aumentando la
cities and
migración en las
comunas.
comunas, se
As the
van creando
migration
unidades
grows in these
enfocadas en trabajar con
comunas,
migrantes.
cities are more focused on working with
Pero yo no me
migrants.
atrevería a decir que hay un
But
número
I
específico,
wouldn't dare
porque
say that there's a specific
ha habido
number
comunas que, por
because
ejemplo,
there
llegan a
have
un
been comunas
porcentaje
that, for
bajísimo
example,
de
a
personas,
low
pero que están
percent
con
of
unas
migrants arrive,
necesidades
but they
súper
have
urgentes y eso
crucial
implica
needs,
entrar
and
no
this
solamente a resolver
implies
necesidades de
entering to
vivienda o de
this
alimentación,
solve
sino que
issues
también
regarding
hacerse cargo de
housing
barreras
and meals, but
idiomáticas,
also
culturales,
taking charge of
y
language
esto
or
ya ha
cultural
justificado para
barriers.
algunas
And
municipalidades
this is
formalizar un trabajo en temas
justification for
migratorios.
certain mayor's
Yo creo
office
que
to focalize their work on
cuando los
migration
procesos
issues
migratorios
when the
son
migration
tan masivos
processes
como,
are
como
not
de
as
la población,
massive.
o un
Like, for
tercio de la
example,
población sea
50%
migrante,
or one third of the
da la
population are
oportunidad
migrants,
de
it
poder
gives the
pilotear
opportunity
algunas
to be
cosas,
able to
de
make
poder
some
generar
pilot tests
estrategias
to
y
generate
replicar experiencias de otros
strategies,
lugares
replicating
en una
experiences
escala
from other
que no es
places
tan
at a
abrumadora. Entonces,
scale
eso es
that
una
is not
oportunidad para poder llevar a
overwhelming.
cabo
This
procesos más
opportunity
cuidados,
to carry out more
a veces
careful
sin tanta
processes,
urgencia,
sometimes
y puedan dar
without that
buenos
much
resultados.
urgency, and could give good
Eh,
results.
pero no sabría decir si es que
But
hay
I
un
wouldn't
porcentaje
be able
mínimo
to
que lo
say
justifique.
if there's a minimum
So that was a
percentage that
very
justifies it.
specific economic question. Let me ask it a different version of that from a different way, which is how do you navigate the potential for a scarcity narrative from long-term residents that assume that a benefit to migrants comes at a loss for them.
Sí, bueno, eso es algo que se repite bastante.
That is something that is
Algo muy
repeated
importante es lo que
often.
mencionaba antes
Something
respecto de que
important that I mentioned with
el
regards
trabajo con
to
migrantes tiene
the
que ser un trabajo
working
que
with
beneficie a toda
migrants
la
has to
comunidad.
be something that benefits all of the community.
Eso es
That is
principalmente en términos
something
de que el
primarily
trabajo
in
sea
terms that
sostenible
for the work
desde
to
la
be
percepción de la
sustainable
gente
from the
y en términos
perception of the
políticos.
people and in political
Pero no deja de ser
terms.
cierto. O sea,
But it's still true.
tener un buen trabajo de integración
having
de la población
having
migrante
good
también va en
integration
beneficio de
process
la
for
población local.
migrant people
Lo que no puede
benefits the
pasar
local
es que
population.
haya
What cannot
beneficios
happen
exclusivos para
is for there
inmigrantes,
to be exclusive benefits just for
a
migrants,
menos que sean cosas que solo los
unless
migrantes
these
necesiten.
are
Por
things that
ejemplo,
only
orientación
migrants
migratoria.
need. For
Eso
example,
por supuesto
migration
que es un beneficio
orientation.
exclusivo que se
This
justifica.
is obviously a
Pero,
justified
por ejemplo, en Chile
exclusive
nosotros hemos
benefit.
tenido el
For
problema
example, in Chile,
de que
we've
para
had the
acceder a
problem
jardines
that in order
infantiles
to
hay
access
un criterio
daycares or
que le
nurseries,
da prioridad
there are
a los hijos de
criteria
inmigrantes irregulares.
that give
Y eso ha
priority
generado
to the
mucha,
children of
mucha
irregular
atención
migrants.
pública.
And this has raised a
Y mi
lot of public
opinión es que eso
attention. And in
no
my
es necesario
opinion,
hacerlo, porque
it's
genera muchos
it's not
problemas que
necessary to do so
los hijos de
because it
inmigrantes
generates a
irregulares
lot of
deberían tener
problems.
el
The
mismo
children
derecho
of
que los
migrants
otros niños
should have the
a
same
acceder a
rights
jardines
as the
infantiles,
children
pero
of
no a
other
una
people to
preferencia.
have access to these
Y,
daycares
es,
or
y ese,
nurseries.
ese
There
elemento
shouldn't
ha
be a
dado pie
preference.
para que haya
And this
discursos
element
políticos
has made it
pidiendo
possible for there to
no
be a
solo
public
quitar
discourse
la derecha de
asking
discriminación positiva,
to
sino que
talk
quitar
about
el
this positive
acceso a jardines
discrimination,
infantiles y a
but
otro
also
tipo de
to
servicios públicos
remove access
a los
from these
migrantes que están en
public
situación
daycares,
irregular.
to these
Entonces,
daycares,
a
to
veces
the
algo que
children
tiene
of
una buena
other
intención
people. So something that might be well
puede que no
intentioned
tenga suficientes
many
criterios
times
de,
enough
de justicia,
criteria for
pero además
justice,
genera una serie de
but
otros
it
problemas. Entonces, eso
also
hay que
generates
evitarlo.
another series of problems. So we should
También
avoid
hay
this.
un tema de
And
narrativas
there's
que
also
creo
an issue
que
regarding
hay
narratives
que ir
that I
cuestionándose.
think
Yo
that
tampoco
we
tengo la
should be
respuesta para esto,
questioning.
pero creo que
I don't have the answer to
hemos,
this as well, but
nos
sometimes
hemos sostenido mucho
we've
en un
sustained a
discurso de
lot. We've
solidaridad y en
stuck
un
on a,
discurso de derechos
a
humanos,
discourse of
que está muy
solidarity
bien,
and human
pero a veces
rights,
esos
which is
discursos no son
okay, but
suficientes
sometimes those
para poder
not enough to be able
contrarrestar
to
discursos que pueden ser
counteract
xenófobos, que
discourses
pueden
that
ser
might be
discriminatorios
full of
o que pueden ser
xenophobia or could be
injustos. O sea,
discriminatory
yo no
or
creo
be
que
a
sea
common sense. I don't think
condenable que una persona,
it's not condemnable that
por ejemplo, acá en
somebody, for
Chile, un
example,
chileno,
here in Chile,
que
a
ve que es muy
Chilean
complicado para
citizen
sus hijos obtener un
who
cupo en la escuela
it's difficult
o
for the
que
child
es
to
difícil
have
acceder a servicios de
opportunity
salud
to
porque no hay
enroll in a
suficientes
school or to
capacidades en la
access
ciudad.
the health services
No me
because there aren't
parece
enough capacities in
que
the
haya que
city. I
condenar
don't
y
think
decirle a
we
esa
should
persona que es
condemn or
racista si es que
say
le
that
echa la
person
culpa a
is
los migrantes. No estoy de
racist
acuerdo yo
if
con
they
esa postura,
blame
pero creo
migrants.
que
I don't
hay que
agree
hacerse
with that
cargo de
positioning,
una
but we
preocupación que
have
puede
to
ser al menos
take
normal
charge
por
of
parte
a
de la población
concern that
acogida
should be
para
normal
decir
for the
de
welcoming
qué manera nos
community
vamos a
to
hacer cargo de
say
manera
in
responsable
which
de que
way
esas
can
personas
I
tengan
be more
acceso a la salud, sin
responsible that
importar
people have
cuál es su
access
origen.
to health services
Y
regardless
ahí
of
hay
their
una
origin.
narrativa en la que nosotros
And
creo que también las
there's a
instituciones que nos
narrative
hemos
that
dedicado
I
a
think
trabajar
that
estos temas de
institutions who have
migración
worked
tenemos
on
que también
migration
ver de qué
issues
manera
have
somos
to also see
más
how we
efectivos
are
a la hora
more
de comunicar las
effective
cosas
when we
y que
start
no sean
communicating,
discursos que solamente nos dejen con la
and for
conciencia
them not to
tranquila a
be
nosotros, pero que
discourses
a
that
veces no
leave
son
our
tan
conscience at
útiles en el
ease,
contexto que tenemos hoy
but
día.
they might not be that useful in the long-term
So,
context. So
when we're thinking about the strategies at the local level and we're thinking about that narrative and making it about all of us, something that I think a lot about, and certainly within my organization, we think a lot about, is how to scope and scale all of these strategies. And in your opinion, can these efforts start locally but move nationally? Or do we have to have a corresponding national push to change policy across the country? Or do these things need to happen simultaneously? How do you create national change?
Sí, yo creo que en eso hay que ser
I think
realistas, en el
that
sentido
we
de
have to be
que si
realistic when it comes
esperamos que
to
el
that,
cambio
in the
a
sense
escala
that if we
nacional
expect
se produzca en
change
los
at a
tiempos que uno
national
quisiera, porque
scale
sin duda un
will take
impulso
place in the
desde el
time
gobierno
frame that
nacional
we
ayuda
want it, because
mucho
even
a que los gobiernos
a
locales puedan avanzar de buena
a
manera,
push
pero
from the central
dice
government can
un dicho
help
lo
the local
perfecto
governments do
es
things
enemigo
well.
de lo
But
bueno, o sea, si
as they
esperamos a tener un
say,
proceso que
the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So it's from what we can do is by promoting these local initiatives that currently exist. I would think that there are things that sometimes are done by local governments that we could translate to a good experience and could be scaled up, and that could be incorporated from the local governments to promote it in other parts of the country when there is good coordination between the national government and the local governments. Those efforts are much more expensive than when they are done separately, without a doubt. So we have to make efforts to align the efforts of local governments based on the discourses that come from the central or national governments. But there are also, it's important to come from the city, and this can be seen in for different reasons. For example, in Chile, migration started going up last century because when nobody wanted to take charge of this, and the improvisation that took place in many cities was a good but yet imperfect beginning because it responded to issues that the central capable of. So there was an institutional learning process that was also error proof that was picked up from other cities and the central government. So sometimes this action that's not necessarily coordinated could allow spaces for innovation that could be positive. Now, how do we scale this when it comes to viability, especially economically speaking? I think it's important to think about initiatives that don't require further economic resource. There are certain things that will require them, but everything that can be done that we've seen is a lot without new budget. It's important because if not, it's not sustainable. I think that in the region we've seen examples of cities that were doing interesting things, but were sustained in international cooperation. But what we've seen with budget cuts, initiatives have been canceled or paused. Where there's opportunity for financing, we have to use them in the best way possible. But let's hope we can use them to install capacities in local governments that are sustainable throughout time and that urgencies, which obviously are a priority, but we also use them to project public policies that will stand the test of time. Because if we can only scale them up only to acquire more and more resources, that's not sustainable.
So, last question, and a big one, but how do we do that faster? How do we move more quickly towards collaboration between private and non-governmental sectors, between national and local? How do we move more quickly towards collaboration when so many parties are reluctant?
Son todas las preguntas muy difíciles, pero
all of your questions are difficult, but this is a personal opinion that and it's okay if somebody doesn't agree with me, but within the Migration Policy Center, we've done an effort to address the debate regarding migration with a discourse that makes sense to people that don't necessarily think the same way we do. It's necessary that the defense of migrant people, that the autonomous exercise of the rights of migrant people is a topic that convenes not only those of us who are convinced of this, but also for it to be a topic that might make sense to those of us contrary visions to migration. So it's important to make it a public priority, not only for migration, but also to understand that investing in these integration topics is a benefit for countries as a whole, and not only a benefit for migrants. And we've attempted to do this at level, at the electoral debate that we have in Chile, because in a few weeks we have presidential elections here. But to do this, we have to leave our comfort zone of these or from these organizations, the academy, these international organizations where we only mention at a human rights focus, which is what we work mostly on, but we have to leave our comfort zone, which I don't think is that effective. they've criticized me many times for saying this, so it's legitimate if somebody doesn't agree with the correct way forward, but this is
I think
how
that's a
we think
perfect
will
note to
work.
end in. All of us getting out of our comfort zone and walking together down this road. Juan Pablo, we are so grateful that you could be here today to share this model, to share your knowledge and experience, and to all of you in the audience for asking those super hard questions that really drew together this amazing conversation. On behalf of all of us, thank you all. We invite you to follow the work of our organizations, the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition, the Center for Migratory Policies, and Alianza America on social media and on our websites. And please stay tuned for future events. Thank you so much for joining us today and being part of this conversation. Juan Pablo, thank you again, and we will all see you all next time.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.